There was a court order to take this house. Not the man who broke the law, the house itself. And the family who owned it had never been charged with anything at all. This is the story of how an American city could seize your home without ever proving you did a single thing wrong, how it did it to more than 1,000 families, and how one house painter and 3 of his neighbors finally forced it to stop. Christos Sourovelis painted houses for a living. For years, he climbed other people's ladders and rolled color onto other people's walls. And slowly it added up to something of his own. A modest 2-story house in the northeast corner of Philadelphia, in a quiet neighborhood called Somerton. It was worth a little over $300,000. He and his wife, Markela, had earned it one wall at a time. It was by every measure an ordinary family home. And ordinary is the whole point of this story. Because what happened to the Sourovelises was not built for criminals. It was built for people exactly like them. In March of 2014, their 22-year-old son, Yanni, made a decision that would reach far past himself. He sold about $40 of heroin to a stranger, and the stranger was a police informant. Within days, Yanni was under arrest. He would later be ordered into court-supervised rehabilitation. $40. A small, ugly mistake by a young man in trouble. His parents hadn't even known he was involved with heroin until the police told them. And here is where you would expect the story to end. A son in the system, a family shaken quietly the way families are. Life going on. Except the city of Philadelphia was not finished with the Sourovelises. Because while everyone was looking at the son, the city had quietly turned its attention to something else. Not the crime, not the $40, the house. On the 8th of May, prosecutors walked into a courtroom with no one from the family present and walked out with an order to seize and seal the Sourovelis home. There was no warning. There was no hearing. There was a knock at the door and an instruction that sounds impossible for a home someone actually owns. Pack a bag and get out. The door Christos had paid for, in the neighborhood he'd chosen to grow old in, was sealed shut by the same city he paid his taxes to. Now, why do you stop and ask the question the Sourovelises asked? How can a government take your house when you have been charged with nothing? Christos hadn't broken a law. Markela hadn't broken a law. How is this even legal? The answer is a strange and powerful tool called civil forfeiture. In an ordinary criminal case, the government accuses a person, and it has to prove that person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil forfeiture flips the whole thing on its head. The government doesn't accuse the person, it accuses the property. The house itself becomes the defendant, as if the walls and the roof had committed a crime, and property has no rights. A house cannot be presumed innocent. A house is not entitled to a lawyer. The owners, the actual human beings, are almost an afterthought, and the burden of proof flips with it. In a criminal trial, the state has to prove that you are guilty. In civil forfeiture, you often have to prove that your own property is innocent, to convince a court that your house, your car, or your cash had nothing to do with a crime, or watch the government keep it. In fact, these cases are given names that sound absurd once you say them out loud. The government versus a house, the government versus a car, the government versus a stack of cash. Read a civil forfeiture docket and you will find the state suing an object. Because an object cannot afford a lawyer, and an object can never say, "But I did nothing wrong." So the Sourovelises did the only thing they could. For about a week, they slept on a relative's couch, a family made homeless in their own city, while the government held the deed to their home like a hostage. They had dropped their son off for court-ordered rehab that very day. By nightfall, they had nowhere of their own to sleep. Everything they owned sat on the other side of a door the city had sealed shut. They were finally allowed back inside on a single condition. Christos had to sign an agreement promising to bar his own son from the house. Read that again. To get their home back, these parents had to give up their son at the door. And if they wanted to actually fight the seizure, to argue they'd done nothing wrong, there was a place they had to go. It was called Courtroom 478 on an upper floor of Philadelphia City Hall. But calling it a courtroom is generous. There was no judge in Courtroom 478. The proceedings were run by the very prosecutors trying to take your property. There were no court-appointed lawyers, no right to counsel at all. Owners were handed forms and more often than not, encouraged simply not to fight. And if you missed a date, If you couldn't get off work, if the letter never reached you, if you didn't understand, you could lose your home automatically by default. This was not a place where justice was weighed. It was a collection department with the seal of the state on the door. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you. The Sourovelis family was not unusual. They were not singled out. They were simply one address on a very long list. It could just as easily have been yours. Not because you did anything, but because someone under your roof did. Or because an officer decided the cash in your pocket looked suspicious. The typical target was never a criminal enterprise. It was an ordinary household that could not afford to hire a lawyer, take days off work, and come back again and again to a hearing built to make them give up. Between 2002 and 2014, the city of Philadelphia used civil forfeiture to take more than 1,200 homes, more than 3,500 cars, over $50 million in cash. And when you look at the typical cash seizure, not the headline cases, the typical one, it was about $178. Sit with that number for a second. $178. This machine was never built to bring down drug lords. It was built to take small amounts from ordinary people, the people with the least ability to hire a lawyer, take a day off work, and fight City Hall. But why? Why would a city grind so hard on people with so little? Follow the money and the whole thing snaps into focus. Under this system, the cash and the cars and the houses the police and prosecutors seized flowed right back into their own budgets. Nearly $6 million a year, money that helped pay the salaries of the very people doing the seizing. Over a single decade, Philadelphia pulled in more this way than Brooklyn and Los Angeles combined. The incentive was built into the machine. The more they took, the more they had to spend. And nothing about that pointed toward mercy. No warrant was needed to begin it, and no conviction was needed to finish it. A prosecutor could move against your property on a Monday, and if you couldn't work through the paperwork perfectly, it could be gone by the end of the month, while the office that took it counted your loss as its own revenue. It had grown so brazen that even the Supreme Court had started to take notice. In 2017, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote that civil forfeiture had produced, his words, egregious and well-chronicled abuses, a system that frequently targets the poor and other groups least able to defend their interests. 2 years later, the court would go further still. In 2019, in a case out of Indiana, the justices ruled unanimously that the Constitution's ban on excessive fines applies to seizures like these in every state. The tide was beginning to turn, but in 2014, none of that had happened yet. But you cannot appeal to the Supreme Court from a relative's couch. So the Sourovelises did something bigger than saving one house. They joined with a public interest law firm, the Institute for Justice, and filed the very first class action in that firm's history. A lawsuit on behalf of everyone Philadelphia had done this to. Christos Sourovelis put his name at the top of it, alongside 3 others the city had taken from: Doyle Welch, Norris Hernandez, and Nasir Geiger. The case wasn't titled around the drugs or the $40 anymore. It was one family and their neighbors against the entire machine. And now the question was no longer whether one painter could win back one house. It was whether an American city could be forced to stop. It took 4 years. 4 years of hearings and filings, of a city with far deeper pockets betting the family would eventually give up, the way almost everyone gave up. The Sourovelises got their own home free within about a year. The city quietly dropped its case against their house, and they kept it. That could have been the end. They could have taken the win and walked away. They didn't drop the class action. And in 2018, Philadelphia gave up the machine itself. The city signed federal agreements that dismantled the program at its foundations. No more seizing homes over simple drug possession. No more taking small amounts of cash from people who were never even arrested. Real judges, not prosecutors, would now run the hearings. The police and the district attorney were banned from spending forfeiture money on their own budgets, cutting the incentive out at the root. And from now on, the government would have to prove that an owner actually knew about a crime before taking their property. The city also created a $3 million fund to pay back the people it had taken from, with those never convicted of anything able to recover the full value of what they'd lost. It was, in plain terms, a surrender. The city was not just settling one family's lawsuit, it was admitting in writing that for years it had run a system the Constitution could not defend, and agreeing never to run it again. And Courtroom 478, the room with no judge, was closed for good. Remember how this began? Not with a guilty man, with a guilty house. A family who had done nothing, told to pack a bag and leave the home they owned. They did nothing wrong, and for a while in America, that wasn't enough to keep their house. Because the entire promise of American justice runs in one direction, the government has to prove it. Before it takes your freedom, before it takes your things, before it takes the roof over your family. In Philadelphia, for years, that promise ran backwards. They took first and left you to prove your way home. It took a house painter and 3 of his neighbors to turn it right side up again. Christos Sourovelis never set out to change the law. He only wanted his house back. But by refusing to walk away once he had it, he helped take the whole machine apart, for everyone still standing in line behind him. The reforms he won did not only return his own house, they rewrote the rules for every family in the city who might someday hear a knock at the door and be told that the home they had paid for was somehow now the accused. If you didn't know your own government could do this, hit like so that more people do.